And you're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We're joined now by Mitch Roschelle. He's a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers and PwC's real estate research leader. Serves as the co-chair of Emerging Trends in Real Estate, which is a leading industry survey. And additionally, he is the publisher of PwC's Real Estate Investor Survey. Welcome, Mitch.
Thanks, Jim, for having me.
And thanks for coming in studio, in fact. All right, you've got a new global study out called Cities of Opportunity 7. Tell us what it is and help teach us what a great city is.
How about I start by telling you what it isn't? All
okay.
Right? So it's not a popularity contest. And oftentimes when you do surveys of places or even things, people weigh in the survey process based upon their emotions. So we didn't do that. We didn't actually ask anybody what they thought. What we did was we looked at a lot of data. And there's 67 different data points that we studied to figure out which city was, in fact, of the 30 cities we looked at, the greatest city in the world, which was London.
What do you define as the greatest city?
So let me go through the criteria. Intellectual capital and innovation, which actually London was the leader in. So these are the 10 criteria that we use. Technology readiness, gateway status, transportation and infrastructure, health, safety, and security. Interestingly enough, Tokyo, which is not in the top 10, won that one. Sustainability and the environment, demographics and livability. Economic clout, London won that one. Ease of doing business, which interestingly enough, Singapore won. And lastly, cost, and that was Johannesburg's to win. So each of those 10 criteria are the big baskets, and then across those we have 67 different attributes, and it's all data-driven.
It's interesting. I was kind of looking at this as you're speaking. No city won more than one. Am I correct on that?
No, London, in terms, took the top place in, if I'm not mistaken, intellectual capital, gateway status, and economic clout. So what's really interesting about that is some of the cities like Amsterdam, which I refer to as Old Amsterdam as opposed to New Amsterdam, and maybe we'll get to that. Amsterdam didn't actually take the top spot in any of the categories, in some of the individual 67, but not in the 10 that I just went through. But they scored high basically across all of the attributes. And that's maybe the answer to the opening question in terms of what makes a good city. It's really the balance of how well a city is, for example, prepared for a disaster, how it cares for its young, how it cares for its old, its tax structure, its regulatory structure. And as I throw out those random of 67 attributes, I'm skipping across the different categories. But that just gives you a feel for those elements that make a city great. And I think the pedestrian view of all of this often focuses on job creation or something economic or something quality of life oriented. So we try to look at it more broadly so that we could evaluate cities amongst their 30 city peer group on a fair basis.
By the way, what are some of the 30 cities?
I'll give you the top 10 because it's interesting and I could run through other random cities in the world. So London's number 1, Singapore is 2, Toronto, interestingly enough, is number 3, Paris 4, Old Amsterdam, I'm still hitting that drum pretty hard, New Amsterdam, New York is 6, Stockholm, San Francisco, so there's another U.S. city, Hong Kong, and then lastly Sydney. I think Lagos in Portugal is the last, if I'm not mistaken. But what's interesting about one of those cities, not that it's a new city by any stretch, none of these are new cities, but the investment in infrastructure that you need to create to become a great city really takes quite a while. And infrastructure just isn't roads and bridges. It's everything from how you educate people to how people come and go into the city for jobs, for living, and so forth. So there's a lot more to it than just...
Would that explain why China, for instance, wouldn't have a city in it?
China, I could pull out my
Shanghai,
Shanghai's in the list. Part of it's infrastructure. Part of it is former communist countries, and my degree's in accounting, not in world history, but those cities that have gone through big transformations in terms of their form of government and the way they view commerce are falling behind a little bit. However, interestingly enough, if you look at China from an education perspective, there's a much greater importance placed on education in China of their youth than there is, quite frankly, in the United States. So this is Cities of Opportunity 7, and if we all live long enough to do Cities of Opportunity 27 or something, literally in a generation, we may see a big difference if we don't figure out how to fix some of our educational infrastructure challenges that we have in the United States.
That's a little scary.
A little scary. Sorry. Didn't mean to scare everybody on a morning.
It's a good point, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of argues for whether we've reached the peak of our our position on the parabola of greatness.
Well, Jim, to that point, New York City had been in the top 5 in the 6 previous years of doing Cities of Opportunity, and this year it slipped, and it slipped behind, what I call Old Amsterdam. When I look at balance, I'll just throw out some random attributes of a city that sort of contribute to greatness, and maybe it paints the picture. Education, transit, health, economics, and governance. Those are different categories, but if whether it be business, whether it be government, whether it be just the electorate, if they place an importance on those kinds of attributes, those are the things that contribute to greatness. How you care for seniors, housing, how friendly a city is to relocation, workforce, risk management, disaster preparedness. Disaster preparedness, quite frankly, probably wasn't an attribute that we would have focused as much attention on. Interestingly enough, you may have noticed that Paris is number 4, and I'm sure on your list of questions you're going to get to with Brexit, why is London number 1?
Who's going to go next?
Right, but think about Paris being number 4, and think about the awful headlines that Paris has found itself in. All acts of human, right? Acts of nature are one thing that happens. Acts of humans is just way worse. The resilience of the city is something that's caused it to score well, and how they've responded to that.
How do you define resilience?
It's interesting. It's a great question, Jim. So it's all third-party data that we use.
Yeah.
So in some instances, it becomes a challenge to actually find resilience. But if something bad happens and the city's economy falters immediately, the city's shut down, commerce stops for a long, protracted period of time, net immigration out of the city as a result, those are indicators of a lack of resilience. Paris didn't exhibit any of those things.
That's a great measure, actually. So it's a tribute to a city, obviously.
And so the report is really about what makes cities great and who are the great cities. And Paris deserves its spot, quite frankly, as and interestingly enough, Paris and London are 3 hours apart by train. And it tells you something.
And getting to London and the thing you mentioned briefly, is Brexit going to be a positive or a negative, do you think, in something like this?
I would say it will have an impact on the future. So this is a full disclosure thing. We started the research for this report right after issuing last year's report, because it takes a while to assemble all the data. And we were getting ready to launch, and then Brexit came, and we said, oh, boy. And we hit the pause button. We actually went back in and looked at all of the data and did some analysis on what the Brexit vote and the likely near-term changes in the economy and what have you from the Brexit vote. We realized how actually resilient the city would be. Clearly economic cloud, some other commerce-related attributes. But we don't weight attributes in the 67 and the 10 categories. We don't weight them. So that means that, don't need to get overly technical, but that means that there's no more emphasis placed on their economic clout, which would suffer, Jim. Okay,
right.
No question about it. Economic clout would suffer. Than how they care for their elderly. So we looked at it and said, you know what? They're leading in all of these categories. Its gateway status is not going to change. It may take a little bit longer at Heathrow because your passport is different because you're not part of the EU anymore, but it's not going to change its gateway status. So we continue to go forward with the survey without a lot of, quite honestly, pushback from the marketplace over that. So,
and we're talking with Mitch Roschelle is a partner at PwC. He's PwC's real estate research leader, and they've just come out with a pretty comprehensive global study called Cities of Opportunity 7. 7, I assume, means the seventh
year, yes.
Which is it every year, or is it?
We do it annually, correct.
Okay. Let me ask you, some things that might appear to be good for a city would hurt their ranking. For instance, cost, right? Is cost, I assume the cost of real estate, et cetera?
Cost of doing business, cost of living.
Yeah, cost of living.
So both of those factors. I'll give you a little interesting nugget about New York buried in the cost data, is that New York is out of the 30 cities 29th, I believe, in terms of individual income tax level. Right, so that's a
negative.
That's a negative. So low cost is a positive. Maybe like a golf score. The lower the number, the better. But low cost is obviously a positive.
Why is Johannesburg so low cost?
I just think that those cities that are early in their stages of development relative to other cities around the world end up having a cost or a lower.
Lagos, Bogota, places like that.
Lower cost structure, which what often happens if you just look at economic cycles, cities like that end up experiencing some point in their life cycle inflation. But in the short run, they end up just being lower. But they don't have the rest of the infrastructure to ascend to greatness. One of the things, actually, to pivot for a second, and in my intro you mentioned that I publish Emerging Trends in Real Estate, which is a joint effort of PwC and the Urban Land Institute. And we look at, in the U.S., only 75 cities. One of the things I realized from doing that study year after year is what makes cities desirable from a real estate investment perspective is low cost of doing business and low cost of living. And when you have the vortex of a city with a low cost of doing business and low cost of living, it makes it desirable for investors because you generally have employment-based growing. So there would have to be more to the Johannesburg story in terms of it being low cost of doing business and low cost of living than just that. There'd have to be more evidence of commerce and livability and stuff like that. And they have other challenges, Johannesburg, in terms of quality of life.
Okay, well, we're going to move to the U.S. in a sec, but let me ask you a couple things first. Toronto was interesting to me. Is there any benefit from the fact that they didn't really suffer in the financial crisis because their banking system was more conservatively run? Is there any?
I would say that that's a fair assessment. They also, their cost structure is better. Their regulatory environment is better. I'm not comparing it to the U.S., but I'm just comparing it to other cities around the world. It's business friendly. It's immigration friendly. And those contribute to the quote-unquote greatness of the city. Their economy, interestingly enough, is somewhat energy dependent. The western portion of Canada is very much like what's going on in Houston is what's going on there. However, Toronto is somewhat removed and independent, just as New York is removed from the energy economy that exists in Texas and the United States. Toronto is somewhat removed from that, so it makes it economic diversity is one of the things that ends up contributing to the greatness because the employment base is diverse and so forth.
So what is this old and new Amsterdam?
Oh, yeah.
Waiting to hear about this.
I threw that tease out there. It's just that I find it ironic that Amsterdam, the city for which New Amsterdam was named, is actually better. And it took, 400 years, but now Amsterdam is actually beating its namesake in New York City. I actually was doing a radio interview on the day that happened to be the anniversary of the claiming of New York City's independence from the Dutch government. But it's really, to me, it's just fascinating. But you can learn, one of the things, you think about infrastructure, for example. These cities are considerably older than any city in the United States. When we were wrapping up the research on this, my family was in Italy. We took the kids to Italy for 2 weeks. And I'm in Venice, and you're amazed that the road infrastructure doesn't exist. It's canals that are, 500 years old. I find the canal system in Venice to be far more functional than the FDR Drive in New York City, right?
Probably not saying much.
Right. So,
and the West Side Highway probably.
Exactly. So what's interesting is some reason the scalability of infrastructure in some of these European cities seems to just be more functional than it is in the United States. So I'll give you another nugget that compares cities. If you land at JFK, or LaGuardia for that matter, in New York, and this is my old Amsterdam, New Amsterdam comparison, and you need to get into the central business district, you are reliant upon taxi cabs. Yeah. Because there's no direct rail. But if you land in Heathrow, you can take the Heathrow Express. You can take the bullet train to Tokyo. In Amsterdam, they have a similar thing. We don't have that. And then here's another little data nugget for you. There are less taxi cabs per capita in New York City, notwithstanding all these newfangled
Uber.
Exactly. Notwithstanding all those, there's less taxi cabs than there is in all of these other cities around the world. We're under taxied. Why? Because our infrastructure. So these are all of those little elements that makes an old Amsterdam 5 and a new Amsterdam 6.
Maybe explains why Biden called LaGuardia a third world airport.
The thing is, notwithstanding all the name calling, that place still works. It
does. It's kind of embarrassing, though. I mean, it's such a.
I close my eyes and just pick up a burger and go right to the gate. But it works, right? Think about the millions of people that go in and out of that place.
Okay, this is a good lead-in because I wanted to come closer to home now. New York, we just talked about them moving out. Something that kind of scared me, and maybe you can explain exactly what it means, is natural and man-made threats that New York's pretty low on, and that you guys uncovered that we have $90 billion of GDP at risk if some event happens.
We try to put something, at the risk of it sounding sensational, we try to look at what the impact of acts of humans or acts of nature would be on a city, just to put into perspective the importance of the right infrastructure to deal with disasters when they happen, whether it be rising sea levels, which would be act of nature, or these awful things that we see in the news.
Only one supply of water, right, coming into New York City right now.
Well, thankfully I live right near it.
You're the last guy that's going to get hurt.
I can just jump right in and stick a straw in the reservoir in Armonk, New York.
On cost, what could New York do to work on that?
I'm not going to narrow it down to New York, and I'm not trying to be politically correct, but just in general, regulation and tax structure, this is an apolitical comment, the cities that are more highly regulated and higher taxed are performing worse in the survey than those that don't have those attributes. So
it matters.
So it matters. The other thing in terms of solving these problems, and I'm asked this question often, I don't think that this is a government fix-it problem. There's three legs to the stool. I think government, business, and the electorate all need to get together. And to the electorate, it's just maybe because of the time of year we're in, I'm using that choice of terms as opposed to just the population. I think all need to work together to figure out how to solve these problems. When you look at cities that are not performing well, they tend to have this finger-pointing mentality of it's that one's fault, it's that one's fault. But I think all three of those stakeholders have major skin in the game in terms of the benefiting from greatness in a city. And when they can all get their agendas aligned, that's when you see cities doing well. So
it's a good point. Gridlock is in the long run is going to eventually
right. So the electorate has a say in gridlock, and they can vote or not vote. And government needs to be responsive to that, and business needs to cooperate with government and not blame it. Blame gets no one anywhere. So we're seeing, if you look into one city versus another, when there seems to be great collaboration between those three primary stakeholder groups, that's when cities tend to score better than others.
Okay, as we get down to our last few minutes, San Fran was 8, Chicago and L.A. were tied for 13. What drives their particular rankings in each case?
They all have individual attributes that are interesting. Clearly, San Francisco has technology, so it was tied for first. Interestingly, Paris for being a hub of intellectual capital innovation. But its scores low, interestingly, on gateway status.
What does that mean exactly?
Gateway status, how easy it is to get in and out of that city. So Chicago has scores better in gateway status because O'Hare is more functional, although they do have rail. You could take a 50-minute subway ride, which is a local, but at least you could take rail. It's better than the Kennedy, which is Chicago's version of the Van Wyck Expressway. Cost is high in San Francisco and rising. Chicago has some quality of life issues, which you can see in the newspapers every day. And Los Angeles is actually rising in the rankings. I would keep an eye on Los Angeles over time from an improvement perspective, because Los Angeles is figuring out quality of life and some of those attributes. But education also remains a problem across all of these urban hubs in the United States. And that's, quite honestly, Jim, a perfect example of where private sector, public sector, and the electorate need to get aligned. And 30-second commercial, it's one of the things we're trying to do at PwC is try to solve where we can, which is the financial literacy crisis which exists. And we made a multi-million-dollar commitment, and so far we've volunteered 1 million hours of teaching kids across the country about the basics of finance. That's a perfect example of, using the resources of business, excess capacity of business, lending it back to the community. Those are the kinds of things that people.
I read about that. That's a great thing, because I have 4 girls, right? And it's interesting. I have, and 2 of them are married. One of the couples, they're absolutely financially illiterate. I'm trying to teach them savings. And the others have really started to pick it up. And now you put that across the U.S. for folks that aren't as educated or as, it's pretty scary.
Ask yourself this. If people understood the basics that if you borrowed money, you have to repay it,
yes,
maybe the financial crisis wouldn't have happened and the world would have been in a different place. I've volunteered personally thousands of hours because I actually lead that initiative for PwC, and I'll be in an inner city school, and when I tell kids that if you borrow money, you have to repay it, it's literally the first time. It's not taught anywhere, right? So it's something maybe we take for granted, but it's just not taught. So anyway, but not to toot our own horn too hard, but that's an example of why doesn't business just do what it can to help solve instead of blaming the system on why.
And you're not doing it to get some PwC benefit, right? I mean, in the
I rarely give it shout outs. Thanks for letting me do it, but unless you cut it and edit. But no. But the fact of the matter is, it's a perfect example. Right? Workforce readiness is a huge issue. It's actually one of the attributes in our study. That's something where why doesn't business figure out how to better? Why doesn't business volunteer time in schools to better educate students for the workforce, as opposed to just complaining that kids come out of school without the right skills? And by the way, in the intellectual capital innovation, I'll give you a crystal ball into the future. Coding is going to be a major issue.
I'm hearing that.
Yeah, that in our country we don't teach kids to code, and some of these other countries that are in this survey that are performing better than us do teach kids to code. That is the number one job skill for the future. So it's a perfect example. So why doesn't big technology companies sort of volunteer in the United States and teach kids to code?
Over and over, we hear the importance of education coming from you, something that we have been basically failing at in the public school system. Just quickly, are there any cities we should keep our eye on in the U.S. that might be coming up? And getting...
I mentioned Los Angeles. I'd keep an eye on Los Angeles, and I wouldn't be surprised if something like New York didn't fall another notch. So,
San Antonio's places in
they're not in the 30s. There's only 4 U.S. cities that are in the 30 every year.
So you've got to be in that 30. You got to make the 30 before.
Correct, and that's based upon population.
Okay. All right, we've been talking with Mark Roschelle, a PwC partner, real estate expert, and this global study is fascinating, and it may be the only one that incorporates so many different factors. I don't know. You want to tell folks where people can find out about it?
PwC.com/cities. That's where you can get a copy of the survey. And if you're social media minded, follow me on Twitter. It's Mitch_Roschelle, and it's ROSCHELLE. I tweet about this stuff all the time.
Fascinating. Thanks for giving us the time. Thanks for coming in studio from
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Professor John Kay and PwC partner Mark Roschelle. Thanks for listening. We'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.